In 1620, a single Spanish galleon left Manila carrying 1.5 million silver pesos, enough metal to move the price of rice across half of Asia. By the time it reached Acapulco, half the coins were already promised to creditors in Madrid. The empire was drowning in silver and in debt. It's the same paradox that haunted every great power after it: wealth that seemed infinite and yet never enough to pay its own bills. Rome called it tribute. Britain called it trade. America called it globalization. But the mechanism was always the same: extract, expand, overextend, then watch the margins vanish. Historians like Paul Kennedy once called it imperial overstretch. The formula is brutally simple. Growth creates control. Control demands defense. Defense devours growth. Every empire, from the Spanish Habsburgs to the United States in the 21st century, hits the same invisible ceiling: the moment when profit turns into maintenance and maintenance becomes debt. And that's when the illusion cracks. The colonizer's power never truly ends in battle. It ends in spreadsheets, interest rates, commodity prices, defaulted loans. The banners fall long after the currency has already collapsed. In 1890, it was the British South Africa Company that triggered a financial panic by speculating on territories it couldn't govern. In 1971, it was the United States, forced to close the gold window because its dollars outnumbered its reserves 40-1. In both cases, the empire's strength had already converted into fiction, printed, leveraged, and exported abroad. The pattern hides behind progress. Railways, telegraphs, the internet, each promised connection and efficiency. Each expanded the empire's reach, and each multiplied its costs. Infrastructure is power until it becomes upkeep. And now imagine the same cycle running again, but without armies or flags. Corporations instead of colonies, data instead of territory, debt instead of gold. The old empires were built on ships and soldiers. The new ones run on credit and code. But both face the same fate: collapse from the inside, when belief itself stops working as currency. History doesn't warn us, it invoices us. The age of empires began not with conquest, but with accounting. In 1494, the Italian mathematician Luca Pacioli published Summa de Arithmetica. It introduced a new tool, double-entry bookkeeping. A simple idea: every credit must have a debit, every gain a loss. And that logic, balance and illusion of balance, would become the foundation of global power. When European kingdoms discovered the New World, they didn't just find gold and land, they found collateral. Colonies became balance sheet assets, territories became cash flow. Spain financed wars with silver from Potosi, the Dutch with spice monopolies, the British with trade surpluses. Every empire created its own financial ecosystem, and everyone believed it could outsmart arithmetic. The Spanish crown was first to test the limits. Between 1557 and 1647, Spain declared state bankruptcy 5 times. The silver galleons kept arriving from the Americas, yet prices inside the empire tripled. Economists now call it the price revolution. In reality, it was an early experiment in global inflation. Too much metal chasing too few goods. Silver made Spain rich on paper, but hollow in substance. Across the Channel, a new model was taking shape. England understood something Spain never did. Power must scale with credit, not treasure. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, turned debt into an instrument of empire. Every pound printed was a promise backed not by gold, but by confidence in the crown. The British didn't need to mine silver, they mined trust. By the mid-18th century, this model had evolved into a global mechanism. Colonies produced raw materials. Ships carried them to London. Factories transformed them into goods sold back to the colonies. It was a self-reinforcing loop, a perfect economic circuit. But like every circuit, it generated heat. Maintaining the system required fleets, ports, soldiers, administrators. The cost of control grew faster than the profits of trade. That tension between expansion and exhaustion is the hidden law of empire. Every step outward creates a matching liability inward. The stronger the projection of power, the more fragile the core becomes. In the 19th century, Britain ruled a quarter of the world's surface, but its domestic economy was already addicted to colonial imports and cheap credit. Industrial wealth masked a deep dependency: cotton from India, food from the Americas, labor from everywhere else. The empire's center consumed what its periphery produced, until the periphery began to realize its own value. France, the Netherlands, Belgium, each replicated the same cycle. Colonies became industrial pipelines, and their profits underwrote national prestige. But the numbers hit a flaw. Growth was externalized. When markets slowed or revolts erupted, the cost of suppression erased the gain. By the early 20th century, the pattern was already visible to economists and strategists alike. Empires do not collapse when they are weak. They collapse when they appear too big to fail. The structure becomes too complex to manage, too expensive to maintain, too rigid to adapt. And when credit dries up, the machinery stops. The Spanish crown had silver, the British Empire had sterling, the Americans had the dollar. Each began as the world's reserve of trust, and each, in its turn, lost that privilege. Today, the mechanisms look different, but the mathematics hasn't changed. Debt still compounds, resources still flow outward, confidence still substitutes for gold. Some historians call it destiny, others call it miscalculation. Either way, the ledger always balances in the end. By 1913, the British pound was accepted in 60% of world trade. Sterling bills financed cotton from India, oil from Persia, and ships crossing every ocean. It seemed eternal, the financial nervous system of the planet. But beneath the surface, the empire was quietly overdrawn. The cost of dominance had become invisible debt. Defending trade routes, policing colonies, subsidizing allies, all funded by credit. When World War I began, the illusion broke. London no longer financed the world, it borrowed from it. The Bank of England printed promissory notes while shipping its remaining gold to America for safekeeping. In less than 4 years, the creditor of the world became its debtor. This was the first modern empire to collapse from inside its own currency, not through invasion or rebellion, but through the mathematics of compound obligation. The United States took the vacant seat. With gold concentrated in Fort Knox and Europe in ruins, the dollar became the world's new anchor. The Bretton Woods system of 1944 formalized what Britain had lost: financial empire disguised as stability. Every currency was tied to the dollar, and the dollar to gold. But just like its predecessors, America mistook dominance for infinity. By the 1960s, the United States had built hundreds of military bases abroad, fought wars in Asia, funded reconstruction in Europe, and expanded domestic welfare. The cost exceeded reality. Dollars flowed out faster than gold flowed in. By 1971, there were more than $30 billion circulating overseas, backed by less than $10 billion in reserves. The math didn't add up. And on August 15th, Richard Nixon announced that the United States would temporarily suspend gold convertibility. The promise was broken. The dollar remained global, not because it was honest, but because there was no alternative. The empire had discovered a new trick: exporting inflation instead of losing territory. The post-war system survived, but its foundation had changed from substance to faith. Money no longer represented metal. It represented narrative. And narratives, unlike gold, can be rewritten. Now the pattern was complete. A colonizer no longer needed colonies. Control could be achieved through debt. Loans replaced conquest. Institutions replaced governors. Interest replaced tribute. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and a network of commercial lenders became instruments of silent expansion. A new geography of dependence emerged. Latin American nations in the 1980s, African economies in the 1990s, Eastern Europe in the 2000s, all absorbed into a system where credit dictated policy. Debt became the leash of modern empire. Every bailout carried a condition, every reform a price. And yet, Inside the metropole, the same logic hollowed the core. The U.S. economy turned from production to speculation. Factories moved overseas. Finance became the export. For every dollar earned, two were borrowed. For every crisis postponed, another one matured. The 2008 financial collapse revealed the real empire, not one of nations, but of balance sheets. A crisis born in American mortgages cascaded through European banks, Asian funds, and emerging markets. Within months, the entire world was synchronized in panic. The center's instability had become everyone's problem. It was the same story Spain lived through 4 centuries earlier, the same trajectory Britain followed a century before, the same mechanism wearing a different name: expansion, dependence, debt, collapse. But here lies the deeper paradox. Empires don't die because others defeat them. They die when they become too efficient at consuming themselves, when the cost of maintaining control outweighs the benefit of having it, when the empire's own instruments, currency, credit, technology, begin to erode its foundations. Some analysts describe it as entropy, others as systemic fatigue. But the essence is simpler. Power carries interest. Every projection of control compounds into future obligation. And when that obligation exceeds the ability to pay, in silver, in gold, or in trust, collapse becomes a mathematical certainty. Imagine the British Navy sailing without fuel, its colonies restless, its creditors calling in loans. Imagine Washington printing trillions to stabilize markets while households lose their homes. Different centuries, same equation. It is not greed that ends empires, it is accounting. When a system must grow to survive, stagnation itself becomes fatal. Expansion stops, and the structure turns inward, consuming its own promise to stay alive. The colonizer collapse pattern is not a myth. It is an algorithm written into the balance sheets of history, and every generation it runs again, faster, quieter, more global than before. Every empire begins with a surplus, not just of wealth, but of confidence. That surplus is converted into expansion, military, commercial, ideological. But expansion creates exposure. To sustain it, the empire must engineer a system that extracts more than it spends. That's where the mechanism begins. At its core lies a loop of illusion, a feedback circuit between power and credit. First comes extraction, colonies, markets, or, in the modern age, resource flows and labor chains. This generates income. Then comes monetization, a currency issued at the center, trusted across the periphery. Finally comes recycling. The profits and savings of the periphery return to the center, buying its bonds, funding its deficits, reinforcing its dominance. The British mastered this system through the City of London. The Americans perfected it through the dollar standard. Both created a structure where others financed their own subordination. The empire exported paper and promises, the world sent back goods and labor. In technical terms, it's called the exorbitant privilege, the ability to pay external costs in your own currency while others must earn it. To the untrained eye, it looks like success. To an accountant, it's leverage, vast, unstable, and dependent on faith. Now, let's trace the wiring. Stage 1, accumulation. A strong center gathers reserves, gold, capital, or trust, and projects them outward. Trade expands, credit flows. The empire's currency becomes the medium of global exchange. Stage 2, saturation. With confidence high, the empire spends more than it earns. Imports rise, debt grows, yet the world continues to accept its paper. The balance of trade turns negative, but prestige compensates for arithmetic. Stage 3, inversion. The periphery accumulates claims, holding the empire's currency as reserve, lending it back through bonds and securities. The flow reverses. The center becomes dependent on the periphery's faith. Stage 4, fragility. A crisis, political, military, or financial, exposes the imbalance. Investors seek safety. The empire prints more money to reassure them. The loop tightens. Inflation or devaluation follows. Stage 5, correction. The empire loses its reserve privilege. Its currency weakens, its assets deflate, its obligations remain. Collapse is not sudden, it's procedural. Confidence decays, then the system reprices reality. Spain did this with silver, Britain with credit, America with liquidity. The pattern differs in costume, never in structure. The mechanics are self-reinforcing. Each success plants the seed of exhaustion. The more efficient the system becomes, the less flexible it is to shock. Complexity replaces resilience. When crises hit, response time shortens, but consequences deepen. And behind every chart or treaty lies the same arithmetic. Interest compounds faster than production. The empire's internal economy becomes addicted to external demand: foreign capital, foreign labor, foreign trust. Remove any one, and the engine sputters. Some historians compare it to a metabolic process. The empire metabolizes the world's resources faster than it can replenish its own. Debt becomes the bloodstream, confidence the oxygen. The collapse begins when the oxygen runs thin, when trust, not treasure, becomes scarce. And now imagine our current century. The network is digital, instantaneous. Money flows through fiber optic veins. Capital moves at the speed of light. But the formula hasn't changed, only the unit of measurement. Where gold once anchored trust, now it's algorithms and central bank balance sheets. The empire still prints, the world still believes, for now. The colonizer collapse pattern is not superstition. It's a closed system, elegant, predictable, and unsustainable by design. Every credit line is a frontier. Every interest payment is a tribute. Every boom is a rehearsal for the bust that follows. In the end, the machine doesn't fail because it breaks. It fails because it works too well. Collapse rarely looks like collapse. At first, it feels like correction, a temporary downturn, a readjustment. Markets dip, currencies wobble, institutions issue calm statements. The real fall begins later, quietly, when confidence erodes faster than reforms can restore it. Spain's empire learned this the hard way. When its silver inflow declined in the 17th century, the crown tried to compensate by minting more coins with less metal. The result was predictable: inflation, distrust, and a cascade of defaults. By 1700, the empire's economy was effectively mortgaged to foreign bankers. Territories rebelled not only against power, but against insolvency. Britain's descent followed a similar curve, but with subtler instruments. After World War II, the empire's colonies sought independence, but London still held their reserves through the sterling area. The illusion of control lingered. Then, in 1967, the pound was devalued by 14%. The world saw what London already knew. Its financial command no longer matched its liabilities. 2 decades later, the empire that once ruled seas was borrowing from the IMF it helped create. Every fall leaves an echo, an institutional ghost. The Spanish left their bureaucracy, the British their banking networks, the Americans their digital infrastructure. Even in decay, the system replicates. Like DNA, it mutates into its next form. But beneath these visible structures lies the human cost, the redistribution of collapse. When an empire's core contracts, its periphery absorbs the shock. The colonies pay through inflation, austerity, and devaluation. The elites of the center preserve their capital. The working classes lose theirs. In the 1980s, Latin American nations spent nearly a decade repaying interest on loans that had already been repaid twice in real terms. The mechanism of tribute simply changed shape, from conquest to conditionality. Every empire builds its crisis into others. When the U.S. Federal Reserve raises rates, entire continents feel the tremor. When its banks fail, emerging markets bleed reserves. It's the same old pattern. The center externalizes pain, then calls it global adjustment. And yet, the real consequence isn't financial, it's psychological. Collapse shatters the narrative of inevitability. People stop believing that the system is self-correcting. Once that belief dissolves, no amount of policy can bring it back. The Spanish crown couldn't convince investors that its silver would return. The British couldn't persuade the world that sterling was stable. The Americans, after 2008, discovered that even the dollar could lose faith for a moment. And that moment was enough to change history. Every crisis erodes the mythology of permanence. When an empire falls, it doesn't vanish overnight, it shrinks into nostalgia. It becomes culture instead of currency. Its monuments remain, cathedrals, railways, aircraft carriers, but stripped of meaning, symbols of what confidence once looked like. By the time the collapse is visible, the real damage is already systemic. Factories are gone, institutions ossified, debt irreversible. The economy becomes a mirror reflecting its own consumption. Growth requires new frontiers, but there are none left to exploit. Expansion turns inward, into surveillance, speculation, self-reference. The empire begins to colonize its own citizens. Look at the numbers. The Roman Empire collapsed when military spending reached 80% of its budget. The Spanish, when interest payments consumed 2/3 of its income. The British, when defense and welfare together outgrew revenue. The United States, when its fiscal deficit exceeded the combined surpluses of its allies. The ratio changes, the rhythm doesn't. Collapse is not chaos, it is arithmetic. It begins when promises exceed production, when leverage replaces labor, when tomorrow becomes the only collateral for today. And when the correction arrives, it is rarely called collapse. It is branded as transition, restructuring, modernization. Each euphemism buys time, but not stability. In that time, new powers emerge, not from ideology, but from necessity. The vacuum of trust demands a new issuer of belief. The baton passes, reluctantly, often violently, to whoever can promise a new kind of order. But the transfer never solves the equation. It merely resets it. The new empire inherits the debts, the institutions, and the illusion that it will be different this time. It never is. Collapse, therefore, is not an end. It's the cost of continuity. And the true measure of empire is not how long it stands, but how gracefully it pays for its mistakes. If this changed how you see the price of power, tell me where you're watching from. Then it was called empire. Today, globalization. Different language, same arithmetic. When the Spanish crown financed its fleets with silver, it created the first global currency. When Washington finances its deficit with treasury bonds, it does the same, but at planetary scale. Both systems depend on one fragile